Hi, Rudyard Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this day 8 of the 2025 federal election. I'm joined in studio by Ginny Roth, Hub contributor, vice president at partner at Crestview. Great to have you back in studio, Ginny. And my wingman, Sean Spear, co-founder of The Hub, is also on the line. Well, guys, let's kick off the show as we do each and every episode with just a quick roundup of where the leaders are at today. Carney's here in the GTA. He's got a big announcement out this morning. We'll get into it a little bit on the show today. Pierre Poilievre is headed to Fredericton, New Brunswick. He's got a rally there, whipping up votes in Eastern Canada. Singh's making an announcement in Victoria, British Columbia, the lower BC mainland, a place where the NDP has seen gains in the past, so we'll keep an eye on that for you. Let's take a look at policy announcements. We always like to be digging into policy here at the Hub. A whole bunch of them. Pierre Poilievre out with a big policy, an interesting one. We'll have some analysis throughout the day here on the Hub and on the hub.ca about a capital gains kind of exemption for a specific period of time, roughly 18 months, where you can kind of get out of an asset where you got huge capital gains and then not get hit with those capital gains in that 18-month period. So hopefully freeing up a bunch of capital to move around and become more efficiently allocated. Mark Carney, mega housing announcement, and we're going to get into it on today's show. $25 billion to create a kind of government-led housing agency that will be, quote, air quote, financed. We'll figure out what that is. Big news there. And the NDP back on housing also, saying in a sense that they want to provide Canadians with same low-cost mortgages that housing developers get in terms of loans from the government. So all and more of this as today goes on here at the Hub. Let's, though, bring Ginny and Sean into the conversation. Ginny, let me start with you. Just a big question. This is week 2 of a campaign. You've been in a lot of campaigns. You've watched them. You've participated in them. What's week 2? How do you, as a kind of marathon runner, think you've got the first 5K done? You're thinking about the next 5K, getting to that debate on the 16th of April, which will be the kind of midpoint of the campaign. What do you want to accomplish in week 2?
So I think it's important to remember with every day that the campaign goes by, there are more new people paying attention. I think this can be overstated sometimes, especially by people who are losing in the polls. They'll say, like, no one's paying attention yet. But it is true. There are a lot of Canadians that are not like us, that are busy, and they'll sort of catch bits of the news here and there, and they'll sort of finally realize, okay, I think there's an election going on, and I've got to start thinking about who I might vote for, if I'm going to vote, whether it's worth it to vote. And so when you capture those people, you have a chance to start to define in their minds what the ballot question is like and what people should vote on. So I think a lot of that will be happening this week. I think there's also a strategy question, which is, have the Liberals who've been climbing in the polls hit their peak? Are they plateauing? I spoke to a pollster I know yesterday, and I said, like, what will you need to see that? And I think there's one more big poll due this week from Leger. And if that shows what we saw over the weekend, which is a plateau for the Liberal number, that I think then presents a new normal for the parties to kind of think about pivoting out of. And the final thing I would say is, we'll get into the policy announcements, but it's interesting to me today that there are sort of dueling policy announcements between the Conservatives and the Liberals. The Liberals are announcing more government as a solution to a problem, and the Conservatives, they're going to be speaking to a national energy corridor, and the substance of the policy entirely is about getting government out of the way to allow the economy to thrive, investment to happen, et cetera. You see this also in the announcement that you mentioned around capital gains. And that is, I think, an attempt to define the ballot question. It's saying, in the context of Trump and the aggressions from the U.S., what does Canada need to do? What does our broad approach need to be stronger? And so continuing to define that ballot question, looking at where the polls sit and where you might be able to see gains or losses for each of those voting pools. Week 2 is important. And with every week that goes by, there's less time to change the fundamentals of the race.
Yeah, smart analysis, Sean. In a sense, this is the week where the campaign starts to come more into focus. Maybe the division, Sean, start to become more real. The first week was a little blurry in that regard. What are you going to be looking for, Sean, as week two unfolds? We've got the big tariffs coming April 2nd.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about what Ginny just set out for the audience. In the sense, Roger, that one of most thinks that early announcements from the Conservatives, including broad-based tax reductions and so on, was almost a bit of throat clearing. Like you had to provide a proposal that would hit lower and middle income earners in order to purchase the political license to then focus on some of the macroeconomic issues that we've been writing and talking about for a long time at the Hub. Pulling more private capital into the economy, deregulation, et cetera. Ideas that I think can have resonance as a package, as a suite of ideas that, as Ginny says, represents a kind of theory of the case, but none of them in and of themselves necessarily have a lot of resonance with individual voters. And so I think a big test for the Conservatives over the coming days is, can they actually start to cohere around a series of individual measures, which in and of themselves, I think, will help the economy, but for which it won't be self-evident to Canadians what they do, how they work, and why collectively they represent a different and better conception of the economy and understanding of the role of government. And I think, if that proves to be the key question looming over this week's political debate, I think that's a healthy thing for the country, and certainly something we at the Hub would like to be part of.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the news the last weekend and into today to catch our listeners and viewers up. It seems to be that Mark Carney is reacting from a position of strength and confidence, Ginny, in seeming to brush off some pretty, well, they're not even allegations. These are stated words by a Liberal candidate here in the GTA who's basically encouraging people to turn into the Toronto consulate dissidents who have bounties on their heads by virtue of the PRC defining them as threats to state security because they were democracy campaigners. I mean, this strikes me as interesting to see the Carney campaign react to something that would just seem so obviously to be a firing offense, and to do so not even necessarily defensively, just confidently saying, we're ignoring this.
Yeah, I struggled to talk about this because I find it so shocking. And I normally like to sort of steel man my opponents in order to think through, where could they possibly be coming from? How can they get themselves out of this? And over the weekend, it seemed like Carney was maybe trying to avoid the issue, like they were buying themselves time to sort out what they would do about this candidate. And to be clear, I also think, by the way, they have time to replace him on the ballot. So it's not like they won't have a candidate in that seat if they give this guy the boot. And not only did they stick by him over the weekend, as I understand it, Carney in his press conference this morning doubled down and said, like, yes, he will be sticking around. He is my candidate. He has my confidence. That's quite shocking. And when you start to think about the reasons why, I really can only come up with one. My theory of this is that Carney, who has been the smartest guy in the room for most of his life, may have gotten advice from strategists saying, dude, in politics, this is not the kind of thing. There's no room for nuance. There's no reason. You've got to move on, right? And I think he won the argument and said, nope, distaste for China is higher than it should be in Canada. They're our second biggest trading partner in the world. We need a future with them, and we can't. I'm going to be the prime minister, and I can't alienate them right now. There was actually a Q&A from a couple days ago. I think it was Thursday or Friday, a press conference where he was asked about China, and he clearly gave the answer that he was not advised to. He gave his true answer, which was basically that they're our second biggest trading partner. We've got to warm relations, and we've got to have a strong relationship with China. This is just his position, I think.
Yeah. Wow, Sean. We seem to be going back to something that got the last prime minister into a lot of trouble, which was an unduly close relationship with China. It extended to his personal foundation. It extended into a very divisive foreign interference inquiry that personally involved the prime minister in national security issues. I don't know. I would think the Liberal Party would have been taking a barge pole out and pushing anything China-related away, but this seems to be an embrace, again, of what Ginny's saying, a kind of core Liberal tenet that Canada's future lies in part through and in China and Beijing.
Well, I'll take the conversation in a slightly different direction. Though I agree with what Ginny said, I also think it reflects something even more basic. There is, I think, an intuition on the part of a lot of Canadians that while all parties have leaned into diaspora politics here in Canada, the Liberals have essentially perfected it. That it is not tangential to the way that they do politics in a lot of large urban ridings. It is core to how they do politics. And what's striking about this MP and candidates' public comments are that they were indeed public, that this is not just something that is happening behind the scenes in private, but that he was audacious enough to lean into diaspora politics in public. And so I actually think this could have implications for the party. It seems self-evident that they ought to dump this candidate. In fact, if I had to bet, I suspect by the end of the week they probably will have. The question is how much damage do they sustain over the time? But I think more fundamentally, it raises questions in the minds of Canadians just about this sense that there is something kind of untoward to the way in which the Liberals do politics at the local level. If we have another instance or two of this coming out, and I think it's not implausible we do, maybe it's not related to China, maybe it's related to the Israel-Hamas question or whatever, it starts to crystallize in the minds of Canadians that the Liberals have a lot of candidates whose focus isn't the Canadian national interest, it's doing politics around the world on our soil.
Yeah. Again, I just remind people this candidate is quoted. I don't know if he wrote it or was quoted. It was a very clear statement that he was urging. And again, was this a joke? I don't know if it was. It's incredibly bad taste that dissidents here in Canada, protected by Canada under Canadian law, should be turned in for bounties to the consulate. Maybe didn't mention the bounty part, but he definitely mentioned the turning into the Toronto consulate. Let's just, in our remaining moments, Ginny, go to Mark Carney's big housing announcement today, because it's a significant one. Billions of dollars to ostensibly stand up a government agency, which is going to kind of lead on housing. It seems to, in a sense, suggest that, yes, the market will be used, the market forces will be at play here, but fundamentally the Liberals want to kind of wrap the hands of their government around the housing file in a way that we haven't seen before, and then details still to come to somehow finance these billions. I don't know where that's debt financing or financing in some bond market I'm unaware of that has low yields. I don't know, Ginny. What do you think about this? It's got a big number attached to it.
Yeah, I was a bit concerned as a conservative when I saw that the Carney would be talking about housing today, because to go back to a conversation we had earlier this week, it is a defensive imperative for Carney to cover his bases on some of the big economy files and some of the big domestic affordability issue files. And housing is one that Poilievre has owned. But as soon as he started speaking, there's a mixed bag in the announcement bucket. There are a number of commitments he's made, and we should say he's talking about reducing development charges. So he is doing some supply side work, but it was an afterthought. If you look at his announcement and the amount of time he spent on not that, but on what he sees the thrust of the announcement, which is big new federal government agency with lots of federal taxpayer money to leverage private investment. He is clearly, one, speaking to the role he sees for the government, an activist role in public policy, which I think is a really good contrast if you're Poilievre, who's saying government should get out of the way. And then two, I think he's really showing his hand in terms of who his voting coalition is. We know that most of his voters are home-owning baby boomers, many of whom either don't make payments on their homes anymore, or if they do, they're very, very small. Those voters don't see housing as a crisis. They have sort of my kid or my grandkid can't afford to buy a house. That's too bad. I really hope he has a housing announcement. And so I think that's what he's gesturing to with this announcement, is sort of people who want to check the box on housing. He's not, and I should give them some credit, there are some liberal YIMBYs, right? There are some of them right for the hub. There are some centrist YIMBYs who think that there is such a crisis that you need to drastically get municipal and provincial governments totally out of the way, cut taxes, cut red tape, and do a massive housing blitz where the private sector just does what it would do anyway and meets demand, the massive amounts of demand with supply. And Carney does not see that, I think, as an imperative. Like, this is not a YIMBY announcement. And I was worried it would be, because I think that would have undercut the Poilievre proposition on this file. Now, the Conservatives have a job to do, which is to make sure that this announcement's framed that way, and that Carney can't now portray himself as some huge, big-time housing guy. And I think they can have some success, particularly if they tie him to the last 10 years of Liberal government.
Yeah.
And isn't a big part of that, Ginny, about definitions? Because as I understand the Liberal announcement, ostensibly we'll learn more throughout the day, it is principally focused on the social housing end of the housing continuum. We might need more social housing. That's an interesting discussion. But for the vast majority of Canadians, when they're talking about housing affordability, they're talking about prices in the market side of the housing market. And that's where Pierre Poilievre has been in his strongest, speaking to that, frankly, middle class sense that that the prospect of owning a home is now elusive and out of their grasp. And whether or not more social housing on the margins helps, it's not obvious to me. But it's almost as if the two parties are addressing different constituencies and different definitions of the housing problem. And the truth is the Conservatives are addressing the one that is salient for a much larger share of the population.
That's right. I should add, it's not just the baby boomers who own their homes who are in Carney's voting coalition. Currently, there are also pretty far left social progressives in that voting coalition. He's holding a lot of NDP voters who I think are voting him for him primarily on the Trump issue and who need to be constantly fed and watered to make sure that he doesn't lose them. So I think a lot of this announcement speaks to, I mean, he spent 5 minutes going on at length about affordable housing, the role of the federal government in affordable housing, returning to our historic role of the federal government's involvement in affordable housing. That speaks to the social housing question that Sean puts forward, and I think that probably has some appeal to those progressives that he has desperately got to hold into his voting coalition, because his entire prospect of forming government falls apart if they don't stick with him.
Well, Jenny, thank you so much for coming on the program. We're going to get you back on the show later this week, and really appreciate all your analysis and insights. Stay right there. Sean, polling's up next on the show today. You can dig deep with our friend David Coletto, who'll be joining us momentarily. Before we go to David, though, let's just give a quick sneak peek of one of the really fascinating slides that he has here, some data that he's bringing to our viewers. Federal vote intention. We'll get that up on the screen for you, and we'll just do a quick run through of that vote intention. Here it is by age. You can see some real what do you call those, like cohort behavior here in terms of 60 and over versus, let's say, 30 to 40, for even up into the 50s. It's a much tighter election, Sean. Basically, for everybody, I don't know what you'd call them. Would that be Gen Z, Sean? Maybe a bit of Gen X. What do you make of that?
Yeah, one of the fascinating things, Rudyard, is that people use different heuristics to think and talk about Canadian politics. There's an understanding of it through the lens of a linguistic divide. There's an understanding of it, of course, through the lens of a regional divide. Some people analyze it as a contest between class interests. But I think what we're seeing playing out this election, and David Coletto at Abacus has done a better job than anyone digging into these numbers, is we increasingly have an electorate polarized along generational lines. As you see, and as our audience sees in that chart, the Conservatives are outperforming the Liberals amongst millennials and Gen Xers, but the Liberals have a commanding lead among older Canadians, those over 60. That population, of course, is no longer our country's largest population subset, but it happens to have the highest propensity for voting. And so, from a kind of political efficiency point of view, if you wanted to be leading amongst one of those bars, it's probably the one that the Liberals presently have a commanding lead with.
Yeah, well, let's bring in the CEO and president of Abacus Data. Hey, David, great to have you on the program.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to see you both again.
So what do you think, David, about this kind of battle of, I don't know, the boomers versus everyone else in this election? How consequential is it? And further to Sean's point, voting propensity. Older voters have these much higher rates of turnout historically. Do you see that as as being a factor that we should keep an eye on in this election as we kick off week 2?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things of this election so far is how boomers are sort of. I wrote a piece where I described them as kind of the liberal saviors in the early days of this revival, right? Because they were really the first to sort of latch on to Mark Carney, and I think one of the reasons is they're paying an immense amount of attention to what's coming out of Washington, right? So they're the last generation who are still tuning into the mainstream media, watching broadcast news like it's, like they're almost mainlining it these days, and it's just on all day long. But I also think that, the reason why I think the Conservatives remain strong with millennials, and there's still some legacy, some effect with even the younger cohorts, is because of the scarcity issue, Sean, that we've talked about in the past, right? Yeah. And so it's no surprise today that Mark Carney is making the play on housing, because I think it's still one of those issues where younger Canadians, if you're under 45, housing is still one of the issues that you want to hear about, you're worried about, you've lost faith that you're ever going to be able to buy. And so while focusing on social housing, I think, is important, how he does it, I'm not going to get in a debate. I'm not the policy guy. But I do think you still have to give people the belief that owning a home, that dream of owning a home, is something they can still achieve. And so, yeah, this generational fight is important. Now, why do boomers matter? Exactly what you said, because they vote. And even in this survey that we just did, we asked people, how likely are you to vote? 80% of those 16 over say they are definitely going to vote. Wow. Only 44% of those under 30 say that, right? Wow. So not only, not the largest generation anymore, but still the largest voter bloc that matters. And so it's like, it's if you're the Liberals, you're just, loving this, because this was a demographic you really struggled with over the last decade.
David, let's bring up your second chart here, because it has some really interesting numbers to break out, again, this kind of generational spread when it comes to different housing issues, different issues overall. We just talked about housing, so talk about some of the other ones here on this chart that you think are particularly salient for our listeners and viewers to understand in terms of how different generations are looking at different issues in different ways.
Well, look first at the first set of bars, or that's reducing your cost of living, right? And it's still the number one issue for everyone except for the boomers. Particularly that Gen X, 55% say it's in their top 2 issues. You follow the next set of bars, and those are folks who say dealing with Trump is in their top 2 issues. And a huge difference between, again, those over 60 and those under 30. More than double the number of boomers are kind of engaged on this Trump question. I think it's partly because it's in way, well, if you don't worry about paying your mortgage, if you're not worried about feeding yourself, well, then I can worry about these existential crises that Trump can, appear to have created. And then look at the fourth one down the line, housing, making housing more affordable. A huge difference. If you're over 60, you're almost like, that's not an issue. I'm not even going to think about it. But if you're under 30, it is one of those issues, particularly for a third who say, I'm going to vote based on the housing plans of the parties that I see out there.
David, over the weekend, you penned a widely circulated essay for us at the Hub on the question of whether this election would ultimately rest on Trump or change. Why don't you overlay that analysis with what you just set out. How is that question of Trump versus change interacting with the age polarization that we've been talking about this morning?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the instincts of parties, which is why you heard lots of commentators say, pivot, pivot, pivot. Conservatives need to go after Trump. I think, what I thought was a data-based argument that I don't think, the conservatives should sound like Trump. I think that is a real vulnerability, but I don't think that they should fall into the trap of going all in and making their own campaign about that. One is because the Liberals are so far ahead on who people think is leading on that, is better on that. And so if you can if you can try to work all your magic to get it to even, you still might lose. But more importantly, there's other issues out there, right? There are 54% of Canadians who say they definitely want to see a change in government. When you frame the choice between dealing with Trump and making your life more affordable, affordability actually wins by 16 points, right? So there's fertile ground, I think, for both the Conservatives and, by the way, for the New Democrats, who have been completely shut out of the conversation, to find space to speak to voters, particularly those under the age of 50, who are still deeply engaged and concerned about whether it's the price of housing, the price of food, the price of fuel, the price of everything that is still there and shows up consistently in the research that we've been doing.
Let's just go back to that graph of yours again, because there's that second set of columns dealing with Donald Trump and the impact of his decisions. That just popped out at me, David. That younger cohort, only 23% saying most important factor versus 49%, more than double for the age group 60 and over. How do we think about that? How do we explain that? And again, could this be a fertile area for the Conservatives, in that there is a not insignificant cohort, albeit they vote at lower rates, but there's a not insignificant cohort going right up into the 50s there, who are not obviously freaked out in the way that the 60 and over set is about Trump.
Yeah, I think there is something, right? I said on another podcast that it's a riskier play, but like the generational dynamics in this election create a space for the Conservatives actually to go out and make the pitch to younger voters, right? They aren't as, I think for two reasons, they aren't as, not to say they aren't as worried about Trump, but they've got other more pressing things to take care of, yes. Right? And in their mind, it can't get much worse. I put some data out on my Substack that asked people, do you think Canada is the greatest country in the world? Well, guess what? Younger Canadians are the most likely to say no to that, right? Why? Because they can't get ahead. They can't get a good job. They can't buy a home. There is a sense that dream, that promise has passed them by, right? So I do think Conservatives can speak to that if, using the framing of the last 10 years and what are you better off today than you were 10 years ago? Yes. I suspect most people under 30 will say absolutely not, right? We lived through a pandemic. I got held back. I can't buy a home. I can't get ahead. So I do think this generational piece is important. The challenge is they don't vote. And so you have to spend resources, not just convincing them to support you, but you also have to spend resources getting them out to the polls. But if, and that's part of the argument I made in the piece, but if the path to get the boomers may be closed because they are so focused on Trump and you can't engage them on that, then at this stage in the game, you've got to figure out, what's the alternative? And the alternative, I think, has to be an argument for a better future for, those two large generations that are sitting there wondering who's talking to us and why do they care?
Let's give you, Sean, the last question for David.
Yeah, at the risk of asking you to psychoanalyze our parents, David, what do you think explains the salience of the Trump issue with older voters? We've had some submissions come in by more experienced authors, and it almost feels like they're motivated by a sense of personal slight. Like they came of age in the era of Canada-U.S. free trade. They were committed to the principles of an open economy and a globalized trading system. And in that sense, Trump's threats and provocations aren't merely material. They're not merely economic. In a way, it's like a direct challenge to their worldview or something. How would you respond to that?
I think your analysis is a good one. I think it's emotional. I think they feel like you've been in a relationship, you've been faithful, right? You've been honest, you've given up some, both sides have put in their share, and then you turn around and cheat on me and you break my heart. Right?
Yeah, many of these boomers already have at least one divorce in their lives. They don't they didn't want a second one.
Also there, right? No, but there's truth in all of this. And so I think that's part of it. But I also think we can't discount just what it does to somebody when you spend your entire day watching what's unfolding from the US. Yeah. So you mix that with that sense of that worldview that you described, Sean, I think is why they're reacting this way. And they have the benefit, for the most part, not all boomers are well off and living in the middle, the homes that are too big for them and are hanging around. But they also have the benefit of being retired, likely, and having lots of time and having lots of money. And, from a consumer perspective, that's a great thing to have, because they've right. But on the other hand, they're also the folks who are saying, I'm not going to buy anything American. I'm not traveling to the US. So they're also voting with their pocketbooks as well. So I think it is really, it's one of those issues that has completely upended, I think, our traditional understanding of politics, and that this older cohort should have been a solid conservative voter, particularly the male side of it. Yes. We saw older women moving towards the Liberals even at the end of last year. And we're like the last hangers on of the Trudeau dynasty, if we're going to call it that. But now even men have moved into their camp in large numbers too.
Yeah. Super smart analysis, David, as always. Thank you so much for coming on the program today. And check out David's big piece for us that landed over the weekend. You can do that right now at www.thehub.ca. Thanks, David. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Well, Sean, a great show. Two really thoughtful back-to-back guests. We're kicking off Monday here on Hub Election 2025 with a lot of mojo. Great to be doing this with you. We're going to say goodbye now to our podcast listeners and to those of you who are just watching the on-demand version of the live stream. But we're going to stick around with our live stream audience to answer some questions, which we do at the end of every program. So if you are listening to this on your podcast feed, or if you are watching the on-demand version, why not show up at 10 a.m., grab a coffee, sit down with Sean, me, and some terrific guests that we'll have onto the program, and get into that chat and be part of this live conversation and have your questions answered. So we'll say goodbye now and then hello in just a few seconds to our live stream chat.